36,000 feet below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, in a place with no light, no warmth, and no sound except the groan of water pressing down with the weight of 100 jumbo jets stacked on a single square inch, a machine the size of a washing machine was falling through total darkness toward the deepest scar on the surface of the planet. Nobody on the surface, ship above, knew exactly what they were about to see. The engineers had built this drone to survive crushing pressure, freezing cold, and total isolation from any radio signal or GPS. What they had not built it to survive was what showed up on the live feed roughly 4 hours into the descent. A shape that should not have been there, moving in a way that nothing at that depth is supposed to move. And by the time the story is over, you will understand exactly why the control room went completely silent, and why 3 of the scientists on that ship still will not talk about what they watched happen next. This story begins at the Mariana Trench, a wound in the ocean floor stretching more than 1,500 miles through the western Pacific, cutting so deep into the crust of the Earth that if you dropped Mount Everest into its deepest point, the peak would still sit more than a mile underwater. The deepest known section, a narrow slot called Challenger Deep, plunges to nearly 36,000 feet, a depth so extreme that the pressure at the bottom is roughly 8 tons, pressing down on every single square inch of surface area. Human beings have visited this place exactly a handful of times in all of recorded history, fewer people than have walked on the moon, and every single expedition that has gone down there has come back describing the same overwhelming sense that they were somewhere the human body and the human mind were simply never designed to be. For most of the 20th century, this part of the ocean was treated less like a scientific frontier and more like a footnote, a number on a chart that nobody had the technology to seriously investigate. Submarines of that era were built to survive combat depths measured in a few hundred feet, not the crushing extremes of the trench. It took until 1960 for the first manned vehicle, a steel sphere called the Trieste, to reach the bottom at all, and the 2 men inside reported the hull creaking under strain the entire way down, unsure until the very last moment whether the metal around them would hold. They spent barely 20 minutes on the ocean floor before beginning the terrifying ascent back toward the light, and for more than 50 years after that single dive, nobody attempted to go back. What changed everything was not curiosity alone. It was the arrival of a new generation of unmanned deep-sea drones, remotely operated, and autonomous vehicles built from materials that did not exist when the Trieste made its lonely trip. These modern drones use pressure-resistant titanium housings, synthetic foam cores engineered specifically to resist compression at extreme depth, and cameras capable of capturing usable footage in near total darkness, using only the faintest ambient light or a narrow beam that the drone carries with it. For the first time, scientists could send something down into the deepest place on the planet without risking a single human life, and they could leave it there far longer than any manned vehicle ever could, watching, recording, and waiting to see what the darkness contained. The mission that produced the footage at the center of this story was designed to be relatively routine, a mapping survey intended to update decades-old sonar data of the trench floor using higher resolution imaging technology. Routine missions like this happen more often than most people realize, quietly cataloging seafloor terrain, water chemistry, and temperature gradients that never make headlines because nothing dramatic is expected to happen. The drone was lowered from the deck of a research vessel just after dawn, its umbilical cable slowly unspooling as it sank past the sunlit surface layer, past the murky twilight zone, where the last traces of blue light disappear, and finally into what oceanographers simply call the midnight zone, a region of permanent and absolute darkness that begins around 3,000 feet and continues all the way to the bottom of the trench. Descending through the midnight zone is its own kind of unsettling experience, even for scientists who have done it dozens of times before. The pressure climbs relentlessly the entire way down, and the temperature drops until it hovers just above freezing, cold enough that equipment has to be specifically engineered to keep its internal electronics from failing. There is no ambient light of any kind at this depth, not even the faintest trace of sunlight filtering down from above, which means every single creature living down here has either evolved its own method of producing light or has abandoned eyesight altogether, relying instead on vibration, chemical signals, and pressure changes to navigate a world of total blackness. It is, in the most literal sense possible, an alien environment sitting directly beneath the boats that cross above it every single day. Roughly 2 hours into the descent, the drone's outward-facing cameras began picking up the first hints of life at this extreme depth, and the footage immediately reminded the scientists watching just how little of this world has ever actually been documented. A ghostly white creature drifted past the lens, translucent enough that its internal organs were faintly visible beneath its skin, its body built not for speed, but for patient, energy-conserving survival in an environment where food arrives so rarely that many trench-dwelling species can go months between meals. Further down, the beam caught the unmistakable flicker of bioluminescence, tiny pulses of blue-green light produced by creatures using their own bodies as lures, weapons, or simply as a way of signaling to potential mates across a void where no other form of communication is possible. Every single one of these organisms represented biology, operating under rules that simply do not apply anywhere near the surface of the planet. What makes the trench such a genuine scientific mystery is not simply that it is difficult to reach. It is that so little of it has ever actually been surveyed in any meaningful detail. Scientists frequently point out that we possess more complete, higher resolution maps of the surface of Mars and the far side of the Moon than we do of our own ocean floor, and the deepest sections of the deepest trenches remain almost entirely unmapped in any real detail. Every single expedition that manages to reach these depths tends to document at least a handful of species that have never been formally cataloged before, and researchers widely agree that entire categories of deep sea life almost certainly remain completely unknown to science, simply because so few machines and so few missions have ever been capable of reaching down far enough or staying down long enough to find them. It was roughly 4 hours into the mission, with the drone hovering just above the trench floor and running its standard mapping sweep, that the sonar operator on board the surface vessel noticed something moving across the returned signal that did not match any known creature in their reference library. Sonar readings at this depth are notoriously difficult to interpret with total confidence, since sound behaves in strange and unpredictable ways under that much pressure, bouncing and distorting across the jagged trench walls in patterns that can easily be misread. But this particular return kept reappearing, moving with a consistent shape and a consistent rhythm that made it very difficult to write off as simple background noise or equipment error, and the crew made the decision to redirect the drone's cameras toward the source of the signal to get a direct visual. What the camera captured next is the footage that has since circulated among researchers and oceanography enthusiasts with a level of fascination usually reserved for far more dramatic discoveries. A massive shape, easily the length of a small bus, drifted slowly into the narrow beam of the drone's lights, its outline emerging from total darkness one section at a time, as the camera struggled to capture the full scale of what was in front of it. The texture visible along its flank did not immediately match any documented species, appearing rougher and more segmented than the smooth-skinned deep-sea creatures typically associated with this part of the ocean, and for several long seconds the only sound in the control room was the quiet hum of equipment, as everyone on board simply stared at the monitor, trying to process exactly what they were looking at. The scientific team's first instinct, and the one that ultimately proved most likely correct, was that they were looking at an unusually large specimen of an already known deep-sea species, quite possibly a giant squid or a colossal squid, both of which are known to inhabit extreme depths and are notoriously difficult to observe alive in their natural environment, because they tend to actively avoid the lights and noise produced by research equipment. Giant squid can reach lengths of over 40 feet, including their long feeding tentacles. Colossal squid, while shorter overall, are considerably heavier and more muscular, equipped with sharp rotating hooks along their tentacles, rather than the simple suckers found on most other squid species. Both animals remain so rarely observed alive in the wild that a clear, extended video encounter of either one is still considered a genuinely significant event within the marine biology community. What made this particular encounter so unusual was not simply the size of the creature, but its behavior once it became aware of the drone's presence. Rather than immediately fleeing into the darkness, the way most deep-sea creatures instinctively do the moment artificial light and noise intrude into their environment, the shape appeared to pause, hovering motionless for several seconds, as though it were actively studying the machine in front of it. Several members of the research team later described the sensation as unmistakably unsettling, less like observing an animal and more like being observed in return, a feeling made even stranger by the knowledge that whatever this creature was, it was almost certainly capable of sensing vibrations, electrical signals, and pressure changes far more precisely than any human being ever could. For nearly a full minute, the drone held its position while the shape drifted slowly around it in a wide, deliberate arc, occasionally passing close enough that individual details became briefly visible in the beam of light. A pale, mottled texture along one section of its body, and what appeared to be the faint outline of an eye considerably larger than anything documented in existing scientific literature for a creature of comparable size. Deep-sea squid species are already known to possess some of the largest eyes in the entire animal kingdom relative to their body size, an adaptation that allows them to detect the faintest traces of bioluminescent light in an otherwise pitch-black environment. But the proportions visible in this footage struck several members of the research team as noticeably larger than anything they had personally encountered before in prior expeditions or published imaging. Eventually, the shape drifted backward into the darkness beyond the reach of the drone's lights, disappearing as gradually as it had first appeared, leaving behind a research team that spent the remainder of the mission in a noticeably quieter, more subdued mood than when the dive had begun. The footage was immediately flagged as a priority for review once the drone was recovered. And in the days that followed, marine biologists not present on the original mission were brought in to examine the recording frame by frame, attempting to identify precise measurements, behavioral patterns, and any distinguishing features that might allow for a confident species identification. The consensus that eventually emerged leaned strongly toward an unusually large colossal squid, though several researchers involved in the review process have been notably careful in interviews to avoid ruling out the possibility that they encountered something considerably rare or possibly even undocumented. This kind of careful, deliberately cautious language is extremely common in deep-sea biology, and it reflects something important about how little confidence even trained experts can have when working at these extreme depths. The lighting conditions are imperfect, the camera angles are limited by the physical constraints of the drone itself, and the behavior of deep-sea creatures under artificial light and noise is still not fully understood, since almost every documented encounter involves an animal reacting to the unnatural presence of human technology, rather than behaving in a way that reflects its true, undisturbed natural state. Scientists are left working from single, brief encounters, trying to extrapolate broader conclusions from footage that lasts only a matter of minutes, captured by a machine that was never actually designed to identify unknown species in the first place. What makes this particular case linger in the minds of the people who reviewed it is not really the footage itself, dramatic as it is, but the broader pattern it fits into. Encounters like this one are becoming steadily more frequent as deep-sea drone technology improves, and more research vessels gain access to extreme depth imaging equipment that simply did not exist a generation ago. Nearly every single expedition that spends meaningful time in the deepest parts of the ocean returns with at least one piece of footage that experts struggle to definitively classify. A shape, a movement, a shadow that fits loosely within known categories, but never quite matches cleanly, leaving behind more open questions than confirmed answers. Taken individually, each of these encounters can be explained away with reasonable confidence. Taken together, across dozens of separate missions and research teams working independently of one another, the pattern becomes considerably harder to dismiss as simple coincidence or misidentification. Part of what makes the ocean floor such a genuinely difficult environment to study, even with modern technology, comes down to a basic and somewhat humbling fact about the scale involved. The Mariana Trench alone covers an area roughly the size of the state of Texas, sitting beneath tens of thousands of feet of water that a drone can only survey a small fraction of during any single mission, given the extreme limitations imposed by battery life, cable length, and mechanical stress on the vehicle itself. A single dive to Challenger deep and back can take the better part of a full day, and even then, the drone is only ever illuminating a narrow cone of visibility directly in front of its lights, meaning the overwhelming majority of the trench floor and everything living on or above it remains completely unobserved by any human instrument at any given moment. Oceanographers frequently compare the experience of exploring the deep sea to walking through a pitch-black, unfamiliar room, using nothing but a small flashlight, catching brief glimpses of scattered objects without ever seeing the full shape of the space around you. Multiply that limited field of vision across an area the size of an entire state, sitting beneath crushing pressure that only a handful of specialized vehicles on Earth are even capable of surviving, and the reason so much of the ocean floor remains genuinely mysterious becomes considerably easier to understand. It is not that scientists lack curiosity or ambition. It is that the physical scale of the environment, combined with the extreme engineering demands of operating machinery at these depths, makes truly comprehensive exploration a project that will likely take many more decades to meaningfully complete. This particular mission, once its footage became more widely circulated within the marine science community, reignited an ongoing conversation among researchers about exactly how much of the deep ocean's biodiversity remains formally undocumented. Estimates on this question vary considerably depending on which research group you ask, but a commonly cited figure suggests that somewhere between 2/3 and as much as 90% of all ocean species have never been formally described by science, a staggering number when you consider how thoroughly explored the surface of the planet is by comparison. Every new expedition into extreme depth environments tends to reinforce this estimate rather than shrink it, regularly turning up creatures that require entirely new scientific classifications simply because nothing similar has ever been documented before. Some of the explanation for this gap lies in simple economics. Building and operating a deep-sea capable research vessel, along with the drones and support equipment required to survive trench-level pressure, represents an enormous financial investment that relatively few institutions around the world are able to fund on a regular basis. Space exploration, by comparison, tends to attract dramatically larger public funding and media attention, despite the fact that reaching the deepest points of our own ocean floor presents engineering challenges that are, in some very real respects, comparable in difficulty to reaching orbit. The result is a strange imbalance where humanity has successfully placed rovers on the surface of Mars and returned detailed images from interstellar space, while a significant percentage of our own planet's deepest terrain remains entirely unmapped and unexplored. The creature encountered during this particular mission, whatever its precise identity ultimately turns out to be, has since become something of a case study in exactly this broader problem. Researchers reviewing the footage have pointed out that even basic measurements, such as an accurate estimate of total length, remain genuinely difficult to calculate with confidence, since the drone's camera lacked any fixed reference point of known size, positioned close enough to the creature to allow for precise scaling. Estimates based on the visible portion of its body relative to known dimensions of the drone itself place its length somewhere between 20 and 35 feet. An enormous range that reflects just how much uncertainty remains even when reviewing clear, well-lit video footage frame by frame under careful expert analysis. Beyond the pure scientific mystery, this kind of footage tends to provoke a deeper, more instinctive reaction in almost everyone who watches it, a feeling that goes beyond simple curiosity about biology and taxonomy. There is something genuinely unsettling about confronting direct evidence that enormous, complex, intelligent-seeming creatures are moving through total darkness directly beneath ships, coastlines, and communities every single day, entirely unnoticed and unobserved by the billions of people living their lives on the surface above. The ocean, for all its familiarity as a backdrop to beaches, vacations, and coastal cities, remains in its deepest sections, one of the last genuinely alien environments on the entire planet, closer in many respects to outer space than to anything most people experience in their daily lives. That sense of alien unfamiliarity is compounded by just how differently life has evolved to survive down there compared to almost anywhere else on Earth. Many trench-dwelling species have developed soft, gelatinous bodies specifically because rigid skeletal structures become mechanically inefficient and even dangerous under that much sustained pressure, while others have evolved slow, deliberate metabolisms that allow them to survive for extended periods without food in an environment where a meal might not present itself again for weeks or even months at a time. Predator and prey relationships at these depths often unfold in near total silence and near total darkness, guided by chemical trails, subtle vibrations in the water, and flashes of bioluminescent light rather than anything resembling normal animal behavior, familiar from the surface world most of us actually know. Researchers involved in reviewing the footage have been careful, in nearly every public statement made about the encounter, to avoid sensationalizing what remains, at its core, a genuinely uncertain scientific finding, rather than a confirmed discovery of something entirely new to science. The most likely explanation continues to be an unusually large specimen of a known deep-sea squid species, observed under conditions rare enough to make its exact identification difficult rather than impossible. And yet, even among the scientists who lean firmly toward that conservative, well-grounded explanation, there remains a consistent and genuine acknowledgement that the deep ocean continues to surprise even the most experienced researchers on a fairly regular basis, and that absolute certainty about exactly what lives at these depths simply is not something modern science is currently in a position to offer. What ultimately makes this particular piece of footage so compelling is not necessarily the possibility that something entirely unknown was captured on camera, though that possibility has certainly not been ruled out by anyone directly involved in reviewing the mission. It is the far more grounded, and in some ways more unsettling, realization that even a fully confirmed ordinary explanation still describes an enormous, intelligent-seeming creature moving through total darkness at a depth roughly equivalent to stacking more than 25 Empire State Buildings on top of one another, surviving conditions that would instantly crush almost any manufactured object not specifically engineered to withstand them, in an environment that remains, even now, one of the least understood and least observed places on the entire surface of our own planet. As deep-sea drone technology continues to improve, becoming lighter, more durable, and considerably more affordable than the specialized manned vehicles of earlier generations, missions like this one are expected to become steadily more common in the years immediately ahead. Marine research institutions around the world have already signaled plans to significantly expand ongoing seafloor mapping efforts, driven both by pure scientific curiosity and by more practical concerns tied to climate research, since the deep ocean plays a critical, still not fully understood role in regulating global temperature and carbon absorption on a planetary scale. Each new mission carries with it a genuine possibility of encountering something that current scientific classification simply has no adequate category for yet. For the research team that captured this particular footage, the mission has since become something they return to and revisit with a noticeably different tone than the routine mapping survey it was originally intended to be. Several members of the crew have described the encounter, even months later, as one of the most genuinely unsettling professional experiences of their careers, not because of any specific danger involved, since the drone itself was never at any real risk during the encounter, but because of the unmistakable, lingering sense that they had briefly made direct contact with something that had been living, growing, and moving through that exact stretch of total darkness for years, quite possibly decades, entirely unaware of and completely indifferent to the existence of the species, now studying it from a screen on a ship floating far above. That quiet, unresolved feeling is, in many respects, the truest and most accurate way to understand what the deepest parts of our ocean actually represent. It is not a settled frontier, fully mapped and fully catalogued the way so much of the visible world around us has become. It is instead one of the last remaining genuinely unknown spaces on the entire surface of the Earth, sitting directly beneath the boats, the coastlines, and the daily lives of billions of people, almost entirely unexplored, almost entirely undocumented, and still, even now, largely indifferent to whatever brief flashes of artificial light occasionally drift down into its permanent and absolute darkness. The footage from that particular mission has since been archived alongside a growing collection of similarly unresolved deep-sea encounters, filed carefully by research institutions that understand full well how easily a single unclear video can spiral into exaggerated online speculation if it is not handled with appropriate scientific caution. And yet, even with every reasonable conservative explanation fully accounted for, the footage itself remains genuinely difficult to watch, without feeling a distinct and lingering sense of scale, the overwhelming realization that an entire hidden world, vast, ancient, and almost entirely unexplored, continues on exactly as it always has, completely unconcerned with whether or not anyone above the surface is watching. So the next time you look out across the ocean from a beach, a boat, or a coastal city skyline, it is worth remembering exactly what lies beneath that calm, familiar-looking surface, a darkness deeper than anything most people will ever personally witness, filled with creatures that have evolved across millions of years to survive conditions that would instantly destroy almost anything built by human hands, moving silently through a world that remains, even in an age of satellites and space telescopes, one of the very last genuinely unexplored places left on the entire planet, patiently waiting for the next flicker of artificial light to drift down into the darkness, and for the next set of cameras to catch whatever happens to be passing by when it finally does.